Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at science as a spiritual path. With me is Professor Charles Tart, an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of California at Davis and also emeritus professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Dr. Tart is the author of many books, including Scientific Studies in the Psychic Realm, and Open Mind, Discriminating Mind, and States of Consciousness, and of course, the famous anthology, Altered States of Consciousness. Welcome, Charlie.
Good to be here, Jeff. Nice, tough topic to talk about.
Well, it's an extraordinarily interesting topic because I know we will go into great depth about why science is in fact a spiritual path, but I imagine if you ask most scientists, they would scoff at the idea.
Mm-hmm. Most scientists have bought into a totally materialistic view of the world. You know, we're just here because of some subatomic particles bumping into each other in a certain way purely by chance a zillion years ago, and we happen to end up here and it means nothing.
Yeah.
And so all the conventional ideas about spirituality and religion are dropped. So, yeah, officially, by and large, science totally rejects that. They can do it in a sensible way of simply saying, we have expert knowledge in dealing with the material stuff and we don't really know anything about the physical, so we won't talk about it. But it often extends into a put down of the spiritual. Well, now, I'm going to put myself down at the beginning of this thing. I feel like I can talk as an expert about science. I'm good at it. I've been doing it for a long time.
You have hundreds of published papers in scientific journals.
It's an objective criteria that I know this stuff. Spirituality, I would consider myself a spiritual seeker, but I'm not an accomplished spiritual person by any means. But I'm trying, and I think a lot of people are in that position, so hopefully I can say something useful.
Well, let me ask you this question. Can't you be a materialist and an atheist and still be on a spiritual path?
What would spiritual mean in that case?
It might mean seeking the truth. You could be a seeker.
Well, you can use the word spiritual in a very broad sense that way, and that would be a noble sort of thing to do. But I wouldn't want to broaden spiritual quite that much. To me, when I use the term spiritual, I'm using it roughly, because we can only do it roughly now, that there's the obvious material world here, which we know a great deal about, and we believe there is some other real level of existence that is more important than this physical level, and from which come values by which we should live our life. You know, love at the material level, people are going to want to explain it away as it's just a hormonal surge through your body or something like that. At the spiritual level, people might say, we know something about love because the spirit of the universe or God or whatever you want to do radiates love or is love or something like that. That's very different. So I can't define that precisely. We don't know enough, but that's kind of the common sense distinction.
Well, I certainly have heard people say with regard to Buddhism that Buddhism is atheistic and materialistic, but it is a spiritual path.
Well, that's actually an incorrect statement as I understand Buddhism. Atheistic usually means you say there is no God. Buddhism says, oh yeah, there are lots of gods, but they can't help you get enlightened because they're not enlightened themselves. So, you know, maybe they'll do you a favor once in a while, but you can't rely on them for anything. You have to clear up the obstructions in your mind that keep you from being enlightened. So, not atheistic in the denials of existence sense.
No, but atheistic in the sense that whatever these entities are, they're not permanent, they're not ultimate.
Right, and they won't, you know, the Buddhism approach is that we have the capacity to be beyond suffering, to be very happy.
Yeah.
But for many reasons, we basically do all sorts of unskillful and stupid things that create all sorts of suffering. And we have to learn what those things are and stop doing them.
Yeah.
And then that suffering will stop from it. That's an oversimplification, of course, but
Right.
you know, as I often remind people, I'm not a Buddhist scholar either, even though I've gotten
Well, I know there are
teachings from
many
a lot of
different
Buddhists.
interpretations of Buddhism.
Oh, yes.
Once, years ago, I interviewed someone, I think is an old friend of yours as well, Walter Anderson, who wrote a book on Buddhism and argued that really the Buddha was no different than a postmodern deconstructionalist philosopher, which is pretty close to being an atheist materialist.
That's one way of looking at some of what the Buddha did. You know, he said that things are compounded, and if you can break them down into parts, they don't have as much power over you. But I think he had a few other things in mind, too. But understand something, okay? Some people make me into some kind of authority on Buddhism. Compared to the man in the street, I guess I'm an authority. But compared to a Buddhist scholar or certified Buddhist teachers, I know nothing, and anything I say about Buddhism can be contradicted by the actual practices of some group that's officially Buddhist.
Well, here's
But
why.
what I know is a Western take on Buddhism, which is what's important
And
for
as you
us
said
now.
earlier, you're a scientist,
Yes, I'm very much a scientist.
credentialed scientist.
And I can make a connection there also because the Buddha did give one teaching which allows science to be applied to Buddhism. The Buddha gave a teaching which he called the teaching to the Kalamas, who were some native group in India. And he basically said, don't believe anything because some authority figure tells you it's true, or because it's a hallowed belief from long past and all that. Anything you hear, test it. If it works out for your good and fits reality, good, keep it. If not, let it go. Well, that's kind of the essence of science, you know. We have theories and beliefs, but those are just our best attempts to make sense of things. Keep going back to what you can actually see about reality and form your beliefs on that basis, and be open to them changing as you learn new things.
So in that sense, if we think of that as a description of science itself, science is a spiritual path. It's constantly adjusting itself in the face of evidence and in the search for truths that are sort of more permanent.
Yes. I think of it that way. I mean, I was raised conventionally as a Lutheran. My grandmother took me to Sunday school and church. You know, grandmothers are the source of unconditional love, so if it was good enough for her, it was good enough for me. And then when I got to be a teenager and thinking for myself and learning science, I began to question a lot of that. But one of the things that I'd been taught, which I still take as a working hypothesis at least, is that God is supremely intelligent and we're made in God's image. That seems to me to mean we should be intelligent, you know. Now, when you're a little kid, you can get away with that. Later on, you learn you're not supposed to apply your intelligence to organized religions to question what has become doctrine. From a scientific perspective, I would say religion starts because people have spiritual experiences, which are very important, and we love to explain things. We're not comfortable unless we explain things. So they make up a theory about it. But then, that's the first step of science. You have something happens, you make up a theory, but then you're supposed to keep testing the theory. But what happens in a religion is suddenly this is holy doctrine and you must believe it or you're a heretic. And so the inquiry stops. I'm, in a sense, advocating an experimental spirituality in religion where, what happens? What theories can you create from that? And are these theories something that you can test and improve and modify and tweak and whatnot?
You also seem to be saying, if I understand you correctly, that if someone is truly a scientist and they're truly willing to examine the data, particularly the data with regard to consciousness, it's going to point them in the direction of the existence of non-physical spiritual realms.
Yes. If they actually look at all the data we have about consciousness, people have experiences and events happen which do not fit into its all physical framework. And if you're truly being scientific, you have to say, that's data that I have to make sense of, not, since it doesn't fit, it couldn't really have happened, I'll forget all about it. That's called prejudice. But it's very common, because a scientist is usually someone who's very technically trained within a particular discipline, but not really trained to question the basics, the paradigm of that discipline itself. Now, that's all right in one way. A scientist is a specialist tweaking things and so forth. But as you get stuck within a particular explanatory framework, you're not able to really look at the data.
And furthermore, practically every scientist earns a PhD degree, a Doctor of Philosophy, and the whole point of philosophy is to question your assumptions.
Yeah, I think that got forgotten somewhere, didn't it? I do that all the time. For instance, I try to practice a basic form of Buddhist meditation, what's usually called Vipassana or insight meditation. And I can't say that, oh gosh, these wonderful spiritual experiences happen to me. They don't. But what I see a lot of times is deeper looks at the way my mind works, and particularly assumptions I have about the way things should be. And not only do I discover assumptions about this is the way it should be, but I notice my mind is actually pushing or pulling slightly on my perception to make it that way, to fit the beliefs I already have. That's not science. I mean, it's comfortable to have your beliefs reinforced, but as they get out of touch with reality, you're in trouble.
And it seems in the area of politics and in the area of religion, the mind actively looks for events in the physical world that reinforce our beliefs.
We have an old-fashioned belief that there are two kinds of mental functioning. One is perception, where we just take in the world as it is. I see you sitting there, I hear your voice, and so forth. And it's all sort of high fidelity. And then I might think about it, which is something different. But what modern psychology and neurology have shown is that actually perception is high-speed automatic thinking. There are filters that are taking in my visual perception of you, my hearing your particular words, and so forth. Most of the time, those filters operate reasonably accurately. I mean, you know, I don't step in front of cars and get run down, but they can seriously distort our view of the world, especially insofar as you don't realize that they are a form of thinking and belief and need to be examined.
I often hear scientists, materialistic scientists, saying that what science does for them, it gives them a sense of wonder about nature itself, how awesome it is.
That's good. A sense of wonder can lead you to look at things more closely. But what science can also do for you is make you feel, I'm a superior person. I'm not like the ordinary uneducated masses out there. I understand how the world works. Which is based on a certain degree of truth, but very quickly inflates your ego and makes you blind.
And I don't know of any tradition in science that says, learn to put aside your ego.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is particularly true in the case of psychology. It's assumed we can just be objective scientists. And I never had any courses in graduate school, for instance, on learning how to observe the workings of my own mind and see what its biases are and so forth. And yet in investigating the unusual things like altered states or parapsychology that I've been involved in, it's become very important for me to see what my biases are, because they affect the way I do things.
So when you're talking about science as a spiritual discipline, I get the impression you're thinking about a science of the future, one that isn't quite yet embodied.
Yes. It's what science could be. It's that the basic method of science to me starts with curiosity. And it's kind of skepticism. You're not happy with your understanding of things. You'd like to understand better. And you're just curious, why do things do that? So then you start out by observing. And if you're intelligent, you realize you're probably a biased and inadequate observer. So are there ways of observing better? Are there instruments I can develop if it's of the physical world, for instance? Are there mental techniques I can develop if I'm trying to observe how the mind works, for instance? So you get data. And data is always primary.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come up with theory about it because we love to come up with theories, and then we fall in love with the theories.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where science has a very strong discipline that says if you want your theory to be considered scientific, it's got to make predictions that are testable. If it doesn't make any testable predictions, it's not science.
Mm.
So then you go out and test. And if the test verifies your theory, that's very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
You may just want to go on refining it. But if it doesn't verify your theory, it's too bad that your theory is elegant, involving quarks, mesons, block universes, and all the fashionable buzzwords. It doesn't work. You got to come up with something new.
Mm-hmm.
And you keep cycling this around and gradually getting better and better ideas. Well, I think we can apply that to the spiritual phenomena that constitute the basis of religion. What actually happens? What affects what happens? And so on and so forth. It's a fascinating challenge, and it's going to improve our lives when we get success at it.
You know, back in the mid-19...
Let me just elaborate that. Improve our lives. For instance, all religions tell us to love our neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard, especially when your neighbors are obnoxious. I find most religions are kind of pretty lightweight when it comes to telling you how to love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain spiritual experiences people have had through the ages in which they realize at an incredibly deep level that we're all one. And of course we love each other. It's no big deal for me to love you. You and I are one. You and I are one with everybody else.
In other words, there's a certain state of consciousness you can enter into.
That's right.
In which that's a natural way of perceiving the world.
And then it becomes easy and sensible to become a good person and contribute to harmony in the world instead of, well, I should be nice even though those no goodniks don't deserve it.
You know, in the mid-1970s, you achieved a certain amount of fame, I guess I would have to say. And I think
Fame or infamy?
You're still infamous and famous for a paper that got published, as I recall, in Science.
Oh, yeah.
When you were a young scholar on state-specific research.
Mm-hmm.
And as I think about our discussion now, that's what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We kind of have an assumption that there's something called ordinary normal consciousness, and that is the best possible way for a mind to work. And any change from that is nuts, crazy and dumb, something like that. But really, the way your mind works has been very strongly channeled by the social conditioning you were put through, and it's very good at helping you pass for normal, getting along in normal life, but it's a specialized instrument. I was giving a lecture once about how different states of consciousness may work better for different things, and I reached in my pockets. I wish I had them now, but I pulled out a pair of pliers that I held in one hand and a screwdriver in the other hand, and I said, okay, how many people think the pair of pliers is the better tool? A bunch of hands went up. And I said, now, how many people think the screwdriver is better? Hands went up, and then they started faltering as everybody started realizing, better for what? Pliers is definitely better for something, and a screwdriver is better for other kinds of things. And I had the realization that our consciousness can go into different states, which is like different tools that are good for some things and not good for others. To be stuck in any one state of consciousness, it's like a hammer is a great tool. Can you fix everything in your house with a hammer? The TV set? Hammers are not good for TV sets.
Well, in the old days, it used to be thought that there were only a handful or less of states of consciousness. You were awake, or you were asleep, or you were dreaming, basically.
Yeah. It's a nice and simple thing, and you were sane or you were crazy. It is the other characterization. But it's more complicated than that. And I mean, that's something we can go into in detail sometime, but for instance, just emotions. Any weak emotion is probably an emotion within your ordinary state of consciousness. You know, I'm a little bothered by that. I'm very pleased by this sort of thing. But when any emotion becomes really strong, I think the way you perceive changes, the way you think changes, and a new kind of whole. You know, if I was in a state of rage, the hell do you have this damn thing here for? You know, it's ugly. And it would be obvious to me. It's an immediate perceptual fact that it's ugly. Well, the state of consciousness has changed the way my perceptual thinking works. You know, we are just beginning to realize that emotions can trigger you into different altered states of consciousness. Some emotions can trigger you into something that may lead to spiritual experiences. That's one of the ways, perhaps, of learning to actually be good instead of just being told to be good. There's a wide open frontier here of how to use our minds better. Which app do you boot up?
Well, I get the impression from our discussion, and when we talk about normal waking consciousness, for some people, the gap between their normal waking state and a state, let's say, of love and compassion is very large. For other people, it may be very slight. It might just take the smallest little nudge from their normal waking state, and they're feeling love and compassion.
Yes. And in many cases, that gives them a great advantage in life. And in other cases, it puts them at a great disadvantage. So, for instance, let's say the gap between ordinary consciousness and rage is very small for some people. Most of the time, they're going to get into a lot of trouble. They just take offense at ridiculous slights. Sometimes it may save their lives when they attack immediately when somebody is attacking them and they don't stop to think about it. You have to learn how to get the tool you need and to learn how to use the tool skillfully, to follow that analogy again.
And so science as a spiritual path would almost require that scientists pay attention moment by moment to their state of consciousness.
Even when you think you're doing an experiment and it's all being handled in a very objective fashion, what are you communicating? I'll give you an example. I was involved in hypnosis research for many years, and there was a big question as to whether is really hypnosis some altered state of consciousness, or is it just that people are suggestible anyway to some extent and they just go along with stuff. And we had a standard way of testing people's response to suggestions. So we did a big experiment where same suggestibility test, but some people would be hypnotized first and some people you just chat with them for 10 minutes instead of going through the hypnosis procedure. Well, I was one of the experimenters in that. It was a multi-laboratory experiment. And I noticed something, though. When I had hypnotized somebody first, I didn't give the suggestibility test in quite the same way. If we just chatted first, I'd say something like, well, now, hold out your arm and imagine you're holding something heavy in it and what it would be like if your arm was getting tired from that. If I'd hypnotize them first, it would be subtle, but hold out your arm and imagine something heavy there pressing down. Well, if you give the test difference, you're going to get a difference that has nothing to do with whether they're hypnotized or not.
And that subtlety
and that was
in your voice
bias.
it would be very hard to instrumentalize or operationalize scientifically.
I noticed it in myself, I presented this at a laboratory meeting, and the other experimenters thought, oh, Charlie, he's morbidly introspective, you know. We're objective scientists, you know, we do this. I said, okay, if it's true, then you won't mind if I put a microphone in the laboratory and just record the experimenters giving the first suggestibility test. Then give them to judges who don't know what condition is supposed to be what, and let them guess had the person been hypnotized or not. They picked him up extremely well. These experimenters were all biased, totally unknown for them. We had to do the whole experiment over with a tape recorded test so that it would always be done the same way.
Isn't that
How often do we do
interesting?
that in life, you know? A doctor can ask you about your condition and by subtle intonations in their voice kind of push you one way or the other and you're thinking about reporting it and whatnot. Same thing on the spiritual sort of thing. Somebody can tell you that love is what you need to develop, and there'd be a way of saying that. Fortunately, I can't think of how to demonstrate it that would make it clear that, of course, a sinner like you probably isn't going to do it, but you should do it, versus something that would make it sound like, oh, yeah, this is easy and natural.
Right. Take this step with me. We can invite ourselves, or we can kind of push a person in a way that they'll resist the push and go the other direction.
When I've trained graduate students, I've tried to impress on them the importance of knowing your biases, learning to pick up on your moods and feelings and how it might affect what you're doing. I don't know how successful I've been, but
But there are areas of science where this is essential. For example, field research in anthropology, or field research in the social sciences in general, where it's been taught, I think, since George Herbert Mead in the 1930s, that you have to know your own biases.
Yeah.
You have to lay them out right away.
And you may not know you have them until you see what happens in the results. For instance, if you're doing some kind of polling and you're dressed in a certain way, some people will immediately identify you as somebody they don't like, even though you're supposedly just asking an objective question. Do you like this or that or something like that? The results are skewed right then and there.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. It gives me a lot of insight as to the potential for science in the future.
Oh, yes. I think we can science and spirituality can eventually help each other get more effective. So that when I tease people with that question, has there been any progress in spirituality in the last couple of centuries? Someday I hope the answer will be yes.
And I do sometimes hear people use a term that when I first heard it made chills go up and down my spine.
What was that?
Spiritual science.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not saying that spirituality is all going to be explained away by some kind of cold science. I'm saying that science can be opened up by a spirituality, and spirituality can get more accurate and more effective by proper use of science.
Dr. Charles Tart, what a pleasure to share this half hour with you. Thank you so much for being with me.
The pleasure is mine also.
And thank you for being with us.